Hello, and welcome to the first ever SAEM Education Research Journal Club. I'm Doug Franzen. I'm Eric
Chappelle.
and we're here on behalf of the SAEM Education Committee. Today's journal club is going to be a little bit different than the usual journal club format where you discuss an article and then dissect it and then decide how you might apply it. And instead, we thought what would be helpful would be to learn a little bit more about some different methodologies that are being used in education research. So today we're actually going to talk about how to use a qualitative framework and a scoping review. And instead of us being the ones that dissect the manuscripts, we thought it would be more interesting to bring in the people who wrote them and also some editors to help provide their perspective.
Yes, and I'd like to credit, everybody on our subcommittee and others that contributed to this, including, Doug Franzen, who just kicked us off, Joseph Turner, Catherine Ritter, who's going to be talking about the first paper, Liz Yetter, who's going to be talking about our second paper, Kemi Carter, who's our chair of the education committee, as well as Quentin Patterson, who's here as an author to discuss the first paper, Holly Coretta-Wire, who's here to discuss our second paper from the authorship side, and then also from the editorial side, Lainey Yaris, who's here to discuss paper number 1, which was submitted to Amit and Dan Schumacher for paper number 2, which was a rhyme submission at Academic Medicine. And with that, I will pass it off to Catherine to get us started on paper number 1.
Thank you. So the first paper we will be talking about is examining enablers and barriers to entrustable professional activity acquisition using the theoretical domains framework, which was a qualitative framework analysis study. So this study examined the implementation of EPAs by identifying barriers and facilitators to acquiring high-quality EPAs in Canadian emergency medicine residency programs. So EM residents and faculty participated in semi-structured interviews, and then a qualitative framework analysis was performed using the theoretical domains framework. So to dive in deeper to the methods that were used in this study, the first question I want to pose is to Quentin, which is what prompted you to do this study in the first place, and why did you choose the methodology that you used to answer the research question?
So thanks for having me. Thanks for your question. I'll preface all my answers with the fact that I'm still a junior researcher. Talking about methodologies and things doesn't roll off the tongue as easy because it's still a new language to me a little bit. So I hope you'll just all pardon my imposter syndrome mixed with naivety and some of these things. But essentially what prompted me to do this was I was a senior resident. I wasn't officially a competence by design resident, but I was using EPAs as an end user. And then as a senior resident, I was also completing EPAs for junior residents. And time again, barriers would come up that, I just needed to get at least one EPA shift and it just didn't happen, or it'd be done a week later, poor quality. And I would continually hear kind of the same reasons from others as well as residents myself about why they weren't getting done. And then I would see faculty development initiatives ongoing that weren't really addressing the anecdotal barriers that I was seeing, and they weren't really sharing the enablers that I was seeing. So I looked into the literature, there wasn't really anything out there, and being that CBD was a newly implemented endeavor in Royal College training streams, I wanted to do something scholarly in this regard as part of my area of special interest in my emergency medicine training. That's what prompted me to pursue this and gather a team together to put something onto a paper.
Thank you. And then why did you choose the methodology that you used in this paper to answer the research question that you were looking at?
Sure. So I felt that a qualitative approach would be very important because there was a lot of richness in data that I wanted to gather, and knowing that quantitative has a tendency to lose out on that rich data sets, I pursued a qualitative approach. And then when I met with this research team that also had an interest in answering the clinical or this research question, Dr. Chung had experience with the theoretical domains framework. Teresa Chan and I had worked previously, and she has, as we all know, extensive experience with qualitative studies, specifically framework analyses. So as we put our minds together, this seemed like a good option because it's very good for for analyzing semi-structured interviews with a lot of large portion of data that's homogeneous in nature, and kind of really distilling it down into an analyzable data set that's potentially actionable.
And how did you become comfortable using that qualitative approach? And for any of us who maybe haven't used a qualitative approach in any of our research studies before, did you have any resources that you used to help reference in order to get started?
So I wouldn't say got comfortable because I'm still uncomfortable because it's challenging, but I'm gaining comfort in it, I would say. Teresa and I did a study a few years ago, and I found that by working with a senior researcher that's well-versed in this methodology, that was kind of my first best step. So my recommendation for anyone interested in doing these things is to find someone that's done it before and kind of learn under them. And having read about kind of qualitative studies and framework analyses, from what I've gathered, sometimes people do it because it seems easy, but there's actually a lot of nuance in it, which I'm still learning as well. Now, when it comes to resources, there is a study done by, or a paper, sorry, written by Nicola Gale from 2013 in the BMC journal. It was about using the framework method for analysis of qualitative data in multidisciplinary health research. And I found that was a really nice overview. It talks about some of the pitfalls, some of the benefits. So that was a really excellent source. And then just my go-to resource for any qualitative research is a book, Understanding Medical Education, Evidence Theory and Practice. I found that as a really nice go-to for, broad strokes overview of how to approach answering a research question in medical education. And, it starts out kind of qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and then why you would choose one of those three umbrellas. And then it kind of talks about some of the nuanced methodologies underneath that can be pursued.
That's really helpful to know, especially as we're thinking about what specific methodology we want to use as we're answering our research questions. So to dive a little bit deeper into the methods that you all use, let's get started with step one, which was transcribing all of these semi-structured interviews that were performed with the emergency medicine residents and faculty who were participants. So first of all, how did you choose a transcription service? And is there anything specific that we should look for if we're trying to choose a transcription service for qualitative studies?
Sure. So I don't have the best of answers because my answer to that is I went with who Teresa recommended. That being said, the benefits that I found from our transcriptionists were that they had very tight turnaround times. Like within 48 hours, I had a transcribed, de-identified document. And I found that to be very important because when you're doing live analysis to the point of saturation, you're essentially, you're gathering your data, you're transcribing it, you're analyzing it, ideally before your next interview is completed. So that, as you go, you kind of reach the point where, I familiarize myself with interview after interview, and I know, okay, we're not really getting any new content here, we can stop. As opposed, so if you have a transcriptionist that has a very long turnover time, it's going to really draw out your data collection time. I think the price was affordable. I don't remember the specifics, unfortunately, but also just and then the other last thing, good security. So sent it to them, they had it in a cloud-based folder, password protected, de-identified, so it kind of met all ethics requirements.
And then to talk a little bit more about the line-by-line coding process that you use. So how exactly did that work where you were doing the line-by-line coding in that cloud-based spreadsheet? Did you have each coder have a specific column that they were using and then compare those columns, or what did that process look like?
So I'll try to verbalize it as clearly as I can. It's a bit tricky, but we use Google Sheets. Once the first transcript was done, what I did was I would take, not too large, but generally they were grouped into paragraphs of specific ideas. And so I set up a spreadsheet where column one would be, the participant code, whether they're column 2, faculty or resident. Line 3 would be page number. Line 4 would be line number. And then line 5 would be kind of who the coders were. And line 6 might be just a chunk of data. So a paragraph. So then as me and the other coder would go through, one of us would start at the top and so sorry, we would essentially set up our spreadsheets so that, row number 1 is paragraph 1, row number 2 is paragraph 2, all the way down. So essentially a transcript is now in an entire spreadsheet or a tab. I would start at the top of the spreadsheet. My other coder would be at the bottom. And what we would do is we would go through each paragraph and we would essentially just bold ideas that seemed to fit within one of the theoretical domain frameworks. And if there were 2 different TDF domains within a paragraph, we would then essentially duplicate that row, create one below, so that way we're ensuring that we're pulling out every single TDF domain and putting it into a separate line. So I would start at the top, my other coder would start at the bottom, we'd kind of meet in the middle at some point and keep going. And then we would essentially make sure that both of us had gone through all of the data, distill out all of the potential TDF domain frameworks and labeled them within another column in the spreadsheet. If there was any disagreement about what code a certain idea should be or whether a certain idea even fits within a code, then we brought in a third person to kind of reconcile differences and come to a conclusion. So it's a bit tricky. Like I can picture this in my head. I hope that I painted a picture that you're able to as well. And I see Teresa's joined us. If she has anything to add, please do. And I'm happy to answer any clarifying questions on that process as well.
All right, thanks for sharing that process. And then for the indexing step that you described, how exactly does that work where you're organizing the data into the themes and sub-themes?
So what we did, the tab that I just described would have essentially created an entire tab where every single idea within a transcript is coded into one of the 14 domains. What we did next was of all of our transcripts or tabs, we now have 14 tabs because we had 14 transcripts. I would take out every single line that matched a specific TDF domain, and I would add it to a new spreadsheet. So of the 14 domains, I now had a new spreadsheet, 14 tabs at the bottom, one for each of the TDF domains, and it had each of the ideas from all of the multiple transcripts in it. So if there was a behavioral regulation tab, I now had a bunch of lines of data that had specific quotes and bolded quotations and things like that. And so now kind of using a similar methodology, two coders would go through and index this data, and they would do it independently. So one would go through and say, they would first familiarize themselves with all the data within behavioral regulation as a domain. And they would say, okay, I think generally the 5 themes maybe I'm seeing are, A, B, C, D, E. And so they would go through, they would discuss that as a group, come up with these 5 general themes. They would go through, and then if there were any additions, subtractions, mergers, they would kind of make those adjustments. And then once the themes were solidified, they'd go through the data again to find sub themes within each theme. So it's very iterative, kind of making it up as you go. But once you're done the process, it's a very messy process, to be quite honest. It's nothing like quantitative data analysis. But once you go through it, you're familiar with the data, and you come up with this set of themes and sub-themes, you're like, yeah, this matches what I'm reading. It just kind of gives this gut instinct that it's accurate. And then the next step is having all of your authors go through, make sure it matches what they're generally seeing as well.
Great. That's really helpful to have an understanding about all these steps that your team went through as you were analyzing your data in this manner. So now I want to ask Lainey. Oh, actually, I'm just going to ask this question from the chat here. So when you were going through this, were the coders blinded to your hypothesis? And then what were the inter-rater reliability measures that you used in this study?
So we didn't exactly have a hypothesis. Like I guess maybe we had an implicit one in that we're all people that work within CBME and emergency medicine. So we had a unstated hypothesis that there are problems, there are things going well. None of us were blinded to that because we all had an idea of what our research question was, what our own lived experiences were, but we use that to our benefit. And so in the paper, we add in a reflexivity statement. So in qualitative research, that's kind of using our own worldview, recognizing its potential limits, but trying to frame it in a way that's positive to better understand our data because we live it. So we use that to our advantage. And then regarding the inter-rater reliability, we don't measure that. So some qualitative studies will measure that. It's not necessarily needed in all qualitative studies. And because this was a very iterative process, it would have been particularly challenging to measure. But it would have been interesting to measure, I would agree.
And then Teresa?
Yeah, I think we, just to clarify, just so that going a little bit wonky on the methodology, we're coming at it from a constructivist epistemology, right? So both the idea of a hypothesis, blinding, these and inter-rater reliability, these are definitely very post-positivist or positivist kind of framings in terms of where it's coming from. And so these are very hypothetical, deductive kind of perspectives that have more to do with, if you have a hypothesis, then yes, you should know the outcome. You should be making a guess. It's either yes or no, or this or that, or maybe how much. And so your questions would revolve around that. Your methodologies would revolve around that. And the way that you actually set up your whole study and your whole worldview in that study would be coming at it from a yes, no, or a how much kind of framing, which means that there's an exact answer. The history of terms like reliability, they are about how close one construct is to another. Inter-rater reliability comes from the fact that you want to measure how much disagreement there is between 2 raters, for instance. So it really comes from that post-positivist framing, which is to say that they should have some inherent agreement, right? There's an inference that when you're looking for inter-rater reliability, you are actually looking for agreement between 2 raters, and that somehow that should get you closer to some kind of truth. When you're going through that more constructivist paradigm, you are coming at it from the point of view of seeing that multiple people might look at the same item or response or piece of code from very different perspectives. And so you're coming at it from a very different point of view that has to do with how you understand it is co-constructed by all those that look at it. And therefore it comes at it from that different point of view. As Quentin pointed out, you're going to be looking at actually anchoring on what are the worldviews of the investigators, how are we actually combining those worldviews together, and then how do we then represent that to the world that makes sense and has rigor. So those are slightly different paradigms. It's important to kind of tease that apart, because I think a lot of studies, when I'm an editor for like multiple journals, including AEM education and training, one of the big red flags is when you come at it from a constructivist methodology and yet use kind of post-positivist or positivist terms. And if you want to be desk rejected really quickly, that is a great way to do it. And so it's really important to really hunker down and get to know and make sure there's vertical alignment, unless you're doing something really cool like mixed methods, which is really hard in health professions education or medicine and medical sciences in general, because word counts are like small, like less than 5,000 words small. And so a true mixed methods study might have both quant and qual, either sequentially or like in convergence, and in those cases, you would have both methodologies trying to center on some kind of version of interpretation of what's going on. And you can have some of those, but they are much harder to pull off and usually require like 10 to 15,000 words. And so you'll see this a lot more in social science journals and psychology journals and business journals, where they have much more permissive word counts. And in health professions education and medical education, what we tend to see is sequential studies from a program of research. I think, Dan, you've probably seen this, and Holly, you've probably seen this, and Lainey, I know you've done it. But the idea would be like the idea of waltzing between, you do one quant paper in this domain, then you do a qual paper, then you do a quant paper, and people kind of go back and forth between methodologies and as a mixed program of research, but rarely in the same one. That being said, you can do it. Usually you still have to have an epistemological framework that trumps the other one, and it tends to be that the constructivist framing kind of reigns supreme in many ways, and that even the quant is beholden to that idea of just being another data point of looking at something. So that's a very wonky explanation, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about some of these more highfalutin terms like epistemology, because I think, which is like, what is our sense around what we know and how we know it, right? So I think it's important to talk about that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing those distinctions between those paradigms. That's super helpful to put all this into context here. My next question is for Lainey from an editor's perspective. So what things are you looking for when you review a paper using this methodology? And are there specific findings that can make or break it as you're doing these reviews?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Well, let me just say it was a pleasure to review this paper. It's a beautiful paper, and I love reviewing qualitative papers. I think that a lot of the problems that we face in education are well suited to qualitative research. So with that said, as an editor, when I am handling a paper, I basically look for three kind of big categories of things when I'm looking at qualitative papers. First is I want to see a very clearly defined problem, question, or theory that will be explored, and I want to see that that's well suited to a qualitative approach, which usually is exploring a phenomenon and, like Teresa kind of described, thinking about it through the lens or the experience of the participant so that meaning can be made that will help you better understand that problem and begin to approach solutions. It's very helpful if that's framed in a problem gap hook, similar to other types of research. The second thing that I look for specifically with qualitative papers is that there's a clear description of the approach or methodology and the paradigm. And this is really crucial in qualitative research, and it tells me as an editor that these researchers are not only applying a method well suited to the problem, but understand the method that they are applying. And so this paper did that very well. This is a framework analysis study, and it used a constructivist paradigm. And then finally, and this is like a big bucket, but I want to see that that paper was designed, executed, and reported in a way that demonstrates rigor that's specific to qualitative research and demonstrates a thorough understanding of what that means in qualitative research. And there are many resources for this. There are textbooks, there are papers, people base their career upon trying to understand what rigor looks like in qualitative research. But one go-to resource is Bridget O'Brien's paper from Academic Medicine, Standards for Reporting Qualitative Research. And it's just a really good guide if you're approaching as a novice or even an experienced qualitative researcher, and you want to make sure at every step that you're kind of thinking about the important elements for qualitative rigor.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know, and especially hearing about all these resources that are helpful for learning more about these methods. Do the authors have any other resources that would be helpful for us to know about in addition to the ones that we've already talked about?
There's a free ebook that we created on health professions education research that might give people that primer. It's called the Health Professions Education Research Primer. I'll put it in the chat and then maybe people can use it. It is, again, FOMED, funded by the government of Ontario, actually, which is pretty nice. And it talks about all the practical parts, but it does talk about, philosophy of science. There's a whole chapter 1-1 that talks a little bit about that. And then also the nature of evidence, which I think would be very key to this. And feel free to steal it and use it in other circumstances. It's meant to be a primer for those who are embarking in the journey of doing health crisis education, coming at it from those who have maybe done other things before. There's some very infinitely practical stuff, like how to work with your team. And there's some documents that are really more about that kind of like more philosophical content.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate that because that's helpful for continued learning to build off of what we're chatting about in our journal club today. So thank you to Quentin, Teresa, and Lainey for talking about this paper. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz so that we can talk about our second paper for the day.
Thank you so much all for that awesome discussion. So our second paper is the Postgraduate Selection in Medical Education, a scoping review of current priorities and values. So briefly, with an explosion of literature describing postgraduate selection in light of our significantly increasing applications for limited spots, the authors used the first 5 out of 6 framework phrases defined by Arksy and O'Malley to perform a scoping review of the literature and conducted a thematic analysis. They found 5 different perspectives. 1, using available metrics to predict performance in postgraduate training. 2, identifying the best applicants via competitive comparison. 3, seeking alignment between applicant and program in the selection process. 4, ensuring diversity and mitigation of bias and equity in the selection process. And 5, optimizing the logistics or mechanics of the selection process. The 6th phase of the scoping review is going to contribute to future research. To our authors, who are both Holly and Dan, what prompted you to do this study?
So I am pursuing a PhD through Maastricht University, and this is the first study in that kind of program of research. And really, the PhD is focusing on postgraduate selection and its alignment or disalignment with competency-based education. And basically, what I was curious about is how are authors writing about selection? What are their priorities? What are they looking at? What are the problems they're identifying in order to kind of set us up for looking down the road and saying, is what they're writing about aligned with how they're talking about it? Is it aligned with how they're pragmatically going about selection? When we talk about the potential polarities between priorities within competency-based education and postgraduate selection, how do we reconcile those things? And I think, we really wanted to take this deep dive into what are people saying, how are they looking at this, and what directions are they coming at the problem of postgraduate selection with when they write about it and study it? Because we really wanted to ground ourselves in a really sound place before we started embarking on all of the empirical studies.
So you guys chose a scoping review to look into this. Could you explain to us a little more what is a scoping review and how it's different from other types of reviews like systematic reviews or narrative reviews?
Sure. So a systematic review is really best when you have kind of a broader, more emerging topic where there's a lot of literature and you really want to identify gaps and kind of map where the literature is at, the full scope of the literature, as it were. And we wanted to kind of get the full scope of where selection was at. Systematic reviews are really great when you have a bunch of like small empirical studies that you want to pull the data and kind of look forward and say, what am I going to do with this? What are the pragmatic implications? How do I take what's out there and make decisions? Whereas narrative reviews are really great for really emerging kind of bodies of literature where there are some debates, maybe a small amount of papers where like, I just want to synthesize what's out there and really kind of chart a path forward or really give people a sense of, this is what's there. The selection literature is massive, as you'll see if you pull out this paper and literally just look at the chart. And so we really wanted to just kind of say, where are we at? What are the gaps? What's happening here? And a scoping review is best suited to that for us.
I saw on figure 1, started out with 5,400 records, and after the duplicates went through 4,000 and just kind of whittled down from there. It is really a massive body of literature. Let's see, you also went through several different databases, ERIC database, Medline, etc. Can you discuss your choice of databases and what are the differences between these databases?
Sure. So everyone's familiar with PubMed, right? It is where we find the vast majority of kind of our medical literature base. That being said, there are other medical literature bases like Embase that are good to search because they have things there potentially that aren't in PubMed and haven't been, quote unquote, PubMed indexed. Other things, that we looked at, Web of Science looks at science more broadly. Eric looks at education research, and then Google Scholar will pull things from, generally the authors who are talking about this the most to give you just a broad representation of what is out there. And we used all of these different databases really just to kind of come at this discussion and this topic from a bunch of different angles to make sure we weren't really missing things that would contribute to our analysis.
Can you discuss in detail how steps 4 and 5 of the scoping review were completed? This is for those who are not familiar with it, this is the extracting the data and the summarizing results steps.
Sure. So much like doing qualitative research in general, like we put together a big spreadsheet and said, here are the things we want to pull out of every single paper. And some of them are the intuitive stuff, right? Like who is the author, what's the title, etc. And we also pulled out the journal, the geographic location, the specialty it was written in. And then we started doing some fun things with it where we looked at, what is the article type? Is it, the Bordage classification? Is it descriptive? Is it clarification? Is it justification? What is the problem they're talking about? How are they talking about it? What's the research question? Because we wanted to just get a sense, again, of what are they saying? How are they talking about this? And as we went through all of these papers, it kind of crystallized, oh, they're all kind of talking about these various kind of value statements. Like they're making clear, like this is what the problem is. And when they talk about the problem, they kind of have this like, these are the values that I have when I'm looking at the problem of postgraduate selection. And that became the most interesting to us. So that's what we decided to really center on in the analysis. We did something a little bit funky in step 5 because, a lot of scoping reviews, you'll see people go through and read every single paper and talk about every single paper. There are thousands of papers that talk about the same thing in the selection literature. And we were noticing the same 5 things come up over and over and over again. So we treated it like a thematic analysis. So the entire team read the first 10 and said, okay, this is exactly how we want to do the analysis. This makes sense to us. And then Lainey, Dan, and I read the first 30 in depth and kind of got to this agreement around, here are the value statements we're seeing. And then really read the next 50 just to see, can I read across broad geography? Are there things people are talking about that we're not capturing? And then went for another 30 just to ensure we weren't really missing anything. And yes, there's a risk, just as in all qualitative research, when you talk about thematic sufficiency, that maybe we missed something. But these 5 topics really were where the vast majority of the conversation was. And we had kind of these iterative discussions as we were reading them to say, okay, this is what we're seeing as we're going through the extraction sheet very methodologically and pulling out the same data and having these iterative conversations of this is what we're seeing, this is how they're talking about it. Here are the sub-themes that kind of we're pulling out of that. But we went through and kind of synthesized our data from there.
And to Dan Schumacher, what things were you looking for when you review a paper using this methodology? And are there specific findings that can make or break a review?
Yeah, I think I'll highlight a couple of things. Well, first of all, are people using the terms you would expect, and are they using them correctly? So for this, it's like a scoping review. Does this feel and look like a scoping review, or does it seem like some other type of a review is one question that I have. Also, like key words is Arksy and O'Malley, right? That Holly talked about, this is, sort of like a multi-step way of sort of like going about, getting your question right, getting the data you're collecting right, what's in, what's out, and then synthesizing it as Holly talks about, but, so like, it's not just saying that though, but actually then detailing, okay, yes, it does seem like they actually did each of those steps as well. And I think the other thing is getting your question right. I think that, getting your research question right is one of the hardest things to do in research. And, I definitely have read scoping and other types of reviews and other types of research papers, where the question doesn't seem to match the results that they're giving you, right? There's a mismatch there. I think that's actually, unfortunately, kind of common. And so, that you've got that tight link, right? The question is clear. The studies that they've included seem like that's sensible, and they actually give you the results that you would expect from the question that they defined.
All right. And another question for you. What is the RHYME series in academic medicine, and how is this different than regular submissions to academic medicine?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend RHYME if you've not heard about it. So it's Research in Medical Education. It's a supplement that academic medicine puts out once a year, but the submission mechanism actually comes to a committee. And then if you're selected, you actually both present your paper at the AAMC meeting and then also are published in this supplement. So it's kind of a way to get two cracks at academic medicine, you might say. Like if you submit a RHYME paper and you're not accepted, you could take the feedback you get from RHYME and submit it to the usual mechanism that you would submit for academic medicine. People definitely do that, and people also do the reverse. They submit to academic medicine, they get some good feedback, they make some improvements, and then they submit to RHYME. You don't have to do those. I'm just saying that it gives you two whacks at the same journal. And you also can just choose to submit to RHYME right off the bat.
Okay. And for both of you, where can we learn more about this methodology, and do you have any recommended resources?
Yeah, Lainey already beat me to it when she put the link to the JGME series. There's an article in that series that's specifically, by the way, all of the articles in that series are all brief, approachable, useful, high yield. And one of the articles is actually on a scoping review, just a couple of pages long. So for this type of review or any other type, I mean, it's just such a great resource that's out there.
I would agree with that. And also, when I was writing, I looked at scoping reviews and just the variety that was out there and looked at different ways that people had gone about doing them and how they wrote them up. And I mean, there is a broad range, but I think looking at the journal you want to submit your scoping review to, or the, your first choice, second choice, third choice journal, and the scoping reviews they've published, to get a sense of how they like their scoping reviews to be written up, has been really helpful for me. There are a couple of just absolute gems that have been published in academic medicine over the last year to 2 years that I thought were incredibly helpful when I was going through and writing mine.
That's really good advice to look for papers. If it's a new methodology or type of paper that you're writing, to like look for other examples out there. I think it's a really good advice actually, because sometimes the way papers write about how to do something is it can feel very different when you see it sort of a worked example in a real life paper. And so I do think that's really good advice actually.
Going out and finding other examples in other journals. Okay, let's go to the chat. There's a lot of interesting things going on, especially since I think a lot of people have recently finished the recruitment season. So this is a very poignant paper. Doug had commented that their discussions fit within the 5 themes. One of the things that when I was reading the paper was just how I noticed that like people would just kind of go with the one theme. It seemed like, was there any particular theme that dominated among the 5 themes that you did find?
Yes. So people desperately want to be able to predict who is going to be successful in their program. That's why we listed it first. There are thousands, truly thousands of papers. The bulk of what is out there is on this very topic. And it is both predicting who is going to be successful and trying to cook up some sort of brew of metrics that is going to be able to predict that, or predicting who is going to come in and absolutely ruin your life as a program director. And so that is what a lot of people wrote about from a priority perspective. I'm going to give a teaser for a later coming study where I sat in on selection committee meetings where this is clearly a priority for people, especially the latter, predicting, who's going to come in and potentially be problematic, but balancing risk versus reward. I also think that in spite of the smaller amount of literature around alignment, around diversity, equity, and bias, and around kind of the logistics, particularly now that things like signaling are part of the process. Those are big topics that have come up over and over and over again in the selection process. And I find when people really have to grapple with all of that and try to think about, I'm a stakeholder as a program, the applicant is a stakeholder, I really want to ensure that they can do the job. So the patients in the end are also a stakeholder. It's really hard for people to balance all of those priorities when creating a rank list and choosing who they select, which I think is some of the more fascinating things coming out of our later work.
And a question for the editors. Do you think that it's necessary for an author group to focus on one theme to a manuscript published? I agree with Holly's comment that the papers seem focused on one area, but in reality, it's often a balance of multiple, if not all of these.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, actually. I guess I'm focused less on focusing on one and not focusing on too many. I think once you get more than a handful of themes, if you're doing qualitative research, I think you're asking the reader to keep too many things in their head. And so I always ask the question, can you distill it down further than that? Might things go together? Or I actually just published a paper that's fresh in my brain where we had a lot of things that were kind of obvious and less novel, but still important to the question. But we sort of put them all under one bucket and made it the final theme to sort of bury it and say, it's not that it's not important, but we just put it all here so we could focus on the things that were more novel, that would drive thinking a little bit more forward from where it had been. Yeah, so I more think about it from that way.
Also add that, I mean, one of the beauties of review papers is that it allows you to take knowledge that's out there and synthesize it in a new way to find new meaning. And in that sense, I don't know that these authors who wrote these thousands of papers were necessarily intentionally focusing on a theme. They were conducting studies approaching the problem of residency selection. And it was when Holly took a step back and looked at the broad landscape of all the papers out there that she thought, gosh, there's really a bunch of different lenses and values that people are bringing to these specific studies. And let's take a look at that landscape, the landscape of the values and the lenses, to try to get a better sense of what's going on with residency selection. So I agree, you don't have to just focus on one, but this was more of one of the outcomes of the project was realizing the themes that actually existed out there in the literature, rather than, I think, authors intentionally saying, I'm going to study this theme and here's the study I'm going to do.
I feel like this paper really gave us like the bird's eye view of what's all out there. All right, well, thank you both so much for this. This is a great paper.
Thanks, Liz.
I don't know if anybody else out there has other questions. Maybe you are on a phone or something driving, unable to put them in the chat. But if you want to just, reach out with a question and we will continue the conversation. I have a few more questions I would love to ask, but I don't want to hog the discussion.
Go for it.
All right, well, I guess just as a follow-up to the question I just asked, I think when you're thinking about doing some research, doing a project, right, and you have all of these questions and you start looking at, you have all of these questions, you're looking at your data and you're thinking about this, you're thinking about that. I think it was Dan, that said you gotta, like, at some point you have to focus, right? Does your question and your data and your answer all sort of line up? And I guess that's the question I was really trying to ask, is like, how do you explore a topic from multiple different ways and get that through the editorial process, right? I think that's such a tricky needle to thread. And I don't know if you have any advice to the audience other than pick 5 needles and write 5 papers.
I mean, I think that's kind of the point Teresa was making earlier. I think it's a program of research, so you have to come at things from different angles, and it's really hard to do that all in the same paper. I think unless your question is, how are people reconciling their differences? At least I'm hoping that's a thing I'm going to be able to answer with this last study. But I think it is really difficult, particularly, I mean, I'll just give an example from this PhD. We really wanted to examine how residency program directors view selection, but we also wanted to get at perhaps how, the undergraduate medical education community views postgraduate selection. And that's a second PhD, right? So in some cases, it's really hard to be able to get at all of the things you want to. And I've learned that while you may want to see every tree in the forest, sometimes you need to pick a couple of trees to start and then go to the next couple of trees and then, say I'm going to save that tree for later. I'll come back and look at it a little bit harder because it's so interesting. I can't leave it alone, but I have to for right now.
I think that's really good advice. I think that the more questions that you have, I think that means that you're onto something that's good, right? And you leave a lot of unanswered questions, but that means you're in the right space because there's a lot to still know, right? I see Teresa has her hand up.
I was gonna yes and all of that. So brilliant thinking from both Dan and Holly around that. I would say one of the biggest challenges when you're getting started with research is you're often entering into a space that's new to you and there's a billion questions to ask and answer. I think doing a scoping review, for instance, like Holly did at the beginning of a program of research, allows you to really understand what the lay of the land is so you can join the conversation. Because sometimes when you're a junior investigator and you haven't done, unfortunately, your homework, and this is like PhD level homework I'm talking about, like that you might try to replicate something that's how everyone was like, been there, done that, and then you've done all this work and it goes in a awry, right? Because you're not asking the next question. You're asking a question that dozens of people may have already answered. It was still your question, but a scoping review would have maybe helped you reveal that. And so I do think it's really important as you're setting off in your trajectory to think about how you get involved. You don't have to be the lead author in a scoping review, but if you know of people embarking in one, you could help sort abstracts, you can do other things so that you can get to know the literature in a space. And at the very least, if you're not going to do that, like go and like Google Scholar the keywords that you think of and then read voraciously, like go 20 pages deep into Google Scholar. And I mean, if you're going to do that, you might as well do a scoping review in my mind, but like, it depends on what you have time for, right? And so at least become really well-versed, maybe turn it into a lecture for a local faculty development thing, cash in on it in some way. Like not everyone needs to write everything up, I've been told by my mentors. So like you can actually do other works of scholarship, which is great, write a blog post for ICENET, for instance. I know Holly's involved with the ICBME collaborative like me and Dan are, right? Like, so those would be some opportunities where you could, again, make some work of scholarship, leave some mark behind so that someone else doesn't have to reinvent that literature review again, whether it's like a formal scholarly work of art like Holly did in her case, or like a down home easy to read blog for ICENET to give someone else an orientation. And I think that when you do those kind of work, you then ask better questions. You become more refined in what you're answering. And it's kind of like when you first walk into a winery, you may not know what you're looking for. And maybe after a wine tour and after studying sommelier school and really sampling all the world's wines, you can probably note the hints of chocolate in, this new glass of Merlot or something like that. And there's no way you would have known that was there unless you'd done your research of the world's wines, right? And so similar here, you have to go and taste test all of the literature out there so that you know what you're talking about. And I think that makes you a more informed kind of participant in scientific endeavors, and also makes you more highly grantable, more exciting to read, and probably earmarks you for more success overall in publications and stuff like that too, right? And if you don't want to do that, find a friend who's the sommelier and just like follow their follow their lead, right? And so again, not everyone needs to be a PI. I know Holly's already a great PI, but she's going to even be better after her PhD. Dan's a great PI. Lainey's a great PI. There are people out there that would mentor you in, and some people are always cool with being a co-PI or a junior person or middle of the pack person in the authorship. And that's okay, because if that's you, you should do you. And I think there's different ways to be involved in science, and not everyone always has to take the lead and steer the ship. In fact, the world would probably be untenable if we all were doing PI research.
I just wanted to add one more thing to your question, that it is not uncommon, especially in qualitative research, for you to start with an idea that I want to explore this phenomenon, and you have maybe a question in mind, but that question evolves, as does your interview protocol. And it's not even unheard of to switch methodologies while you're kind of halfway into the study. And that's not a bad thing necessarily in qualitative research. That's not a thing in quantitative research. Like, you start out with your question, you have your hypothesis, you have your analysis, and you kind of start over if you decide that that question isn't working. But in qualitative research, that is very much a part of the process. So it goes even, I agree with what Teresa said, and it goes even beyond like really understanding your problem more through the literature. Sometimes it's only when you get immersed in your data that you realize, like, oh, this is really the lens that matters and is most meaningful to the problem that I care about. And at that time, you can make changes with good justification for why and good documentation of what exactly you're doing.
I was going to say that Teresa's advice to find a friend, I think, is great for the people, when you're sort of buried in the trenches and doing the day-to-day work of running a clerkship or running a residency program. And you have all these questions, to realize like there are people that would love to grab your questions and run with them and leave you to continue the grunt work of running their residency. So good advice for anybody listening. And then I think it was Liz asked a really good question. And I think this is a line from Holly's paper, if I remember right, that there's a lot of descriptive studies, a few clarifying studies, and almost no justification studies. And what would we have to do to promote, those clarifying or justification studies?
Yeah, so to ensure everybody's on the same page, description is really what happened. So this is a lot of people who make like a new, here's our selection process, we're describing what happened. Justification is really, did it work? You're comparing it to something else. So, standard practice versus, what we did was somehow better. And then clarification, my personal favorite, is really the process that underlies what you're seeing. And there's also very little of that. There's a couple of really good qualitative studies actually around selection, particularly out of Europe. If you ever want to go down that rabbit hole, Fiona Patterson writes a lot of good stuff. But the vast majority is, here's what we did and here's what happened. I think to really beef up justification certainly is to say, have a deep understanding of what we're doing, and now I'm going to compare this other thing to it. I think we don't really have a good deep understanding of what we're doing. And so doing comparison studies tends to be really hard for folks to prove that something else is better. And then also, how do you measure better when it comes to selection, right? Is it an alteration in your rank list? Is it resident outcomes? A lot of the things we look at for defining success in residency is you re-rank your residents at the end of residency and you decide how you did, right? Or you say, where did they do, how'd they do on the milestones, which is kind of, a poor representation of overall performance and discriminating between your residents as well. So there's a whole host of things that go into that being difficult to do. And then clarification is, it's hard, right? It's hard work to go in and say, what are we doing? What are the processes that underlie this? I will say we called out that both of those things were really necessary at the end of this scoping review, and then promptly said, we're going to go do a bunch of clarification work and hope that it helps. And so, I think the more we kind of nudge people into this conversation and challenge people to think about it differently and in more depth and come at it from different angles, I'm hoping we'll see more of that. But right now, a lot of it is just, let's throw something new at the problem and hope that it sticks and describe it for everyone. And I think, we obviously need to try to move past that in order to make meaningful change.
I would say, as a Canadian looking in on the selection process for GME, one of the biggest questions that you could link up with a health economist or just an economics prof or even an economics master's student would be the economic analysis of the time lost by your faculty as a very early question based on how you do your selection. Like, you'd better off to have these like really awesome recruitment parties and then use the lottery and probably save a lot of time for your program and probably like court the people that you want to court through recruitment, like a lot lawyers do in their firms, and literally just lottery your list after that, because you waste a lot of productivity of your faculty members that way. So like, I love how a lot of our colleagues basically just can't expect any productivity out of American emerge docs from, like, if they're involved in education, from like, sometime in the fall till sometime around the match. And it's a huge loss of productivity. Like 1/3 of your year to almost a half of your year is just gone, where everything slows down, nothing gets done. And there may be like part of that systemic inequity why there's a lot of Canadian content in AEM education and training, because we have a harmonized schedule where the entire country just goes side to the other country, and we're also doing it digitally now. So like, there ain't no travel. So we just have one day for each of the emerge programs across the country.
That loss of productivity is so true. I mean, just think about, for example, everybody on the call, right? Like the stuff going around on the listservs, especially like if you're on the cord listserv, like it is almost silent from about September till about 2 weeks ago, and then it explodes. Or like the number of papers that I've gotten to review in the last week or two has, just like shot up compared to the invites I was getting in October or November. So yeah, it is a loss of productivity. It's terrible.
Yeah, and
love
you probably just do an assessment, right? You can imagine doing an assessment where you look at a median productivity in every other month, and then take that amount of productivity that during that time span, like, and say this would be the approximation, right? In papers, in like hours, in like all the other metrics. Like, I think that that's the other thing that can be really cool, is having other intersectional colleagues who are not necessarily even emergency physicians be collaborators, because that's the secret to having new frameworks and theories and also new ways of looking at things.
I wholeheartedly agree with Teresa. I think having a variety of people that you work with is really helpful. I've done a lot of very big deep dive into organizational psychology as part of this work. The business literature is really fascinating in this domain. I would highly encourage folks. Eric's actually done a fair bit of this and kind of cross-pollinating with other disciplines. like looking at things through different angles really makes our work exponentially more interesting and brings in really cool ideas.
Thank you, everyone. So with just a couple minutes left, we'll just wrap up here. So first, I'd like to just thank everybody for your time. I think this was a great discussion. I think that a lot of really good sort of core concepts in thinking about, this being a methodology-driven journal club, some of these sort of frameworks of thinking about research questions that we discussed. So that's sort of like, what kind of question do I have? And I feel like Teresa Chan talked about this a little bit. Like, do I have a, positivist or post-positive question? Like, is there a single truth that I am trying to uncover that, would probably be more suitable for like a quantitative method? Like, I want a single truth. It'll be yes, no, it'll be like, I will get my answer, and I'm not going to veer, from my methodology like I might with a qualitative. Or do I have this, what I think both studies from this had was this sort of like, the researchers had this idea that like something was going on and we didn't know exactly what it was, and we wanted to know what it was better. And that tends to be the kind of question that's better answered by these methodologies, which is like, we know something is happening, we see something's happening, we feel it, but we want more rigor. It's the kind of stuff that like everybody says at, a conference at court, everybody knows it's true sort of, but nobody actually knows yet because they haven't done it rigorously. And this is the rigor that's applied to be able to, really elaborate, what it is that's going on, that are these things that we like, we sense, we feel, and we can better characterize with rigor, with more accuracy through these methods. And so that sort of, positivist to sort of constructivist, and there are other, paradigms you can use if you want to get more into it. But then also, I think, is my question a descriptive, a justification, or a clarification question? One, that can influence where you're going to put it, because boy, should you be innovative if you're going to get that description study published. And, if you've got really compelling generalizable, justification, or if you've got like really insightful clarification, like those will probably get more mileage. But thinking about, where am I on the description, justification, clarification spectrum? What angle am I uncovering a universal, like something that is inarguably true, false, something like that? Or am I just trying to characterize something to better understand like a phenomenon or something like that, to sort of inform what methodology we're going to use in the future? And with that, I think if anybody has any other questions, feel free to send them to any of us. And if you like the formats, you'd like a different format to sort of focus on methodology versus other things, we thought it would be fun to see, authors and editors, really just dive into the methodology and, leave the rest for your other journal clubs. So if you liked it, let us know. If you didn't like it, let us know. If there are other topics you want to talk about, other methodologies that would be interesting, please feel free to let us know. And otherwise, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
And a big thanks to SAEM for facilitating this, and to Camille and everybody on the education committee for helping us get this off the ground. So we were excited to do it. It's been a lot of fun. I thought this was great. I hope everyone else that at least got something out of it.
Thanks, everyone.